Today's episode of What's the Big Idea is brought to you by Family Dinner. Family dinner. Carving out time, real time, quality time, to sit around the dinner table and talk about your day with family is one of the most powerful ways to stay connected with kids. Plus, it's been shown to build self-esteem and improve family dynamics and communication. Family Dinner. Check it out. Now on to the show. Welcome to What's the Big Idea? I'm your host, Dan Carney. Social and emotional learning has become more prevalent in education during the last decade. From the pages of EdWeek and new books, to PD workshops and efforts by some states to increase the number of school psychologists, SEL is a hot topic, and for good reason. A recent Pew survey of students ages 13 to 17 found that 70% see depression and anxiety as a, quote, major problem in schools, with academic pressure being the number one reason why. And if you read the recently updated edition of Reviving Ophelia, you'll remember that its authors, Mary Pfeiffer and Sarah Gilliam, write at length about the rise of anxiety among teenage girls. So today's episode is dedicated to teachers, going the extra mile to care for students' social and emotional well-being, and to all parents. I recently had the privilege of sitting down with two school psychologists to talk about kids, their sleep, the pressures they face, their vulnerabilities, and the difficulties of being a parent and a kid in 2019. This was truly one of the most enjoyable conversations I've had in a while, and if you're a teacher or a parent or kid for that matter, sit back and listen. I hope you enjoy. I'm very pleased to be joined on the podcast now by Dr. Carmen Anderson and Dr. Greg Koch. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming on the podcast. So I think there's probably a million different ways we could go here in our conversation, but I wanted to start with something that I feel like is becoming more prevalent in media and in education literature, and it's sleep. And I personally don't think I've ever met a human being that gets enough sleep, except maybe like when my kids were like 6 months old, maybe they were getting enough sleep. But after that, I don't think anyone gets enough sleep. What do you see in your work? You work with students of all different ages. Where does sleep fit into the health and well-being of the students we teach?
I think it's important, and oftentimes it doesn't fit in nearly enough. Most of the students that I see are sleep deprived and overscheduled, which creates a problematic combination because they're probably not living up to their potential because they're so tired. And even when they're doing things they enjoy, I don't think they're truly getting a lot of fulfillment out of it because they need more rest.
Are parents aware of this, do you think? Do parents see their child as sleep deprived?
I don't think people spend a lot of time thinking about it. So they probably recognize that their child or children are tired, but I think they themselves are also probably really tired and are not modeling really healthy behavior in that regard. So
Sure.
It starts with the parents, I would say.
Yeah, I think sometimes the parents are so busy worried about their own sleep that the child is, not that they're not thinking about it, but I think sometimes it's a struggle for all of us. Like, am I getting enough sleep? I think most of us probably struggle. We were just talking today about it. And are you a light sleeper or a heavy sleeper? And Carmen, I think you're a light sleeper.
That is correct.
I'm a medium sleeper.
Okay. I'm a heavy sleeper for the first half of the night, and then a very light sleeper.
Well,
I mix it up.
Counter these people who I kind of refer to as sleep braggers because they talk about like, oh, I don't know what you're talking about, sleep deprivation. My head hits the pillow and I'm out and I sleep like a log until the alarm goes off in the morning. And I'm always like, are there really people like that?
You know what? I'm someone who enjoys sleep. I could sleep in until 10 or 11 o'clock if I was allowed, but with 3 kids at home, that's just not a possibility anymore. But back in my college days, I'm a night owl. So I would stay up until 2 or 3 and then sleep in. And my mom did the same thing and her father did the same thing.
Yeah. Do you think school should start later?
Yeah, I do think that school. I'm opposed to the idea of really early starts. This idea, which I think we're kind of moving away from now as a society, where you'd have high schools would have like this 7 o'clock 0 period, just brutal for a teenager, because we know the sleep cycle is different for teenagers.
Okay. Hey, Carmen.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, if you walk through the hallways, you can see students barely able to keep their eyes open during their early blocks. And then I think as the day wears on and they've had a few snacks or they've had lunch, you can see them become more energized. And students make comments to me all the time about how they would rather start later. In fact, I had a student discussing this very topic with me the other day.
Yeah, the sweet spot seems to be that sort of 9 to
Yes.
11.
Mm-hmm.
You get them before they're hungry for lunch.
Yep.
But when after they've woken up, yeah, for sure. So when you talk to students about whatever they're going through, all the things going on in their life, is sleep something that they bring up, or do they recognize themselves as, if only I got more sleep, I might feel a bit better? Are they aware in that way?
I'm going to say no. If I ask them if they would like more sleep or if they think they should get more sleep, they say yes, but they're not likely to bring it up on their own. What I hear more of is there's not enough time. And it could just be the environment that we're in, and that our students, I feel, are pretty driven, and there's a lot of competition. And I think there's a lot of pressure on them to succeed, whatever that means. And so students are staying up late. I had a student tell me last week that her mom actually tries to enforce a bedtime, and she sets her alarm for 2:30 in the morning so she can wake up, do some homework in the middle of the night, because she doesn't have enough time to complete everything that's required for the next day. I don't think that's the norm. That's definitely an extreme story, but those are the kinds of things that I hear.
And that's the pressure to succeed kind of reason. Then the other side I see, because I work half the week in community mental health in Santa Ana, is the kids who have sleep associated with some other thing they're struggling with. Like maybe they have anxiety or depression. So one of my kind of regular questions asking kids I work with is, how are you sleeping? And I see some kids who have tremendous sleep problems, and I always feel like if someone's struggling, especially if you're struggling with, you're depressed or you're anxious, until we regulate the sleep, it's a lot harder to make progress, because it so much controls our mood and our outlook on life.
Yeah, when I've talked to middle school students, it's amazing the variation you get. Some students seem really dedicated, or their parents are dedicated to that bedtime. Oh, I'm in bed by 9:30. And then other students, it's mind-blowing. Midnight on a Tuesday. I just don't see how you're functioning. But back to your point about the pressure, and yes, we have driven students, and they're feeling a lot of pressure. Just yesterday, I was talking to somebody who was telling me about some report that came across his desk about career readiness for kindergarten. And, he said, his comment was, you couldn't make this kind of stuff up. You couldn't invent it. And I saw something else I saw recently, that the College Board has now rolled out pre-AP, right? Okay, because now we got to have AP as low down as we can. So let's talk a bit about that, the pressure that students are feeling. What's your general feeling about that, or your outlook? What do you see that kind of informs your view of what pressures are students actually feeling right now?
Pressure to achieve good grades is a biggie.
Yeah.
Pressure to create the perfect resume that will get them into the perfect college.
Even in middle school?
Absolutely. Yes.
I think there's this crazy kind of thinking that so many people, we kind of almost unconsciously subscribe to, which is that you have to be ready to get going to college. And then all of a sudden, everybody develops an expectation that you have to be ready to get into an elite college, as opposed to there are thousands of colleges across the country. There's a college out there for everyone, but it's almost like we're all trying to funnel through this narrow little chute. And in so many cases, it's probably unrealistic from the get-go, and then that leads to all this stuff. You mentioned AP, so that now APs have almost become like a requirement. Kids are taking all these APs, are getting stressed out, kids in high school. The ACT, SAT pressure. So it's just, to me, I feel like as adults, as parents, we're being very unconscious in not kind of seeing the broader picture and array of opportunities, and all kind of assuming that kids need to be ready for this elite experience.
Yeah, and how much are kids putting pressure on themselves, or are they? I guess I'm trying to sort of find the granular difference here between direct sort of stress put on by parents versus maybe indirect versus self-imposed stress. How did you sort of delineate that, if I'm even on to something there?
It's a hard question to answer because I really think it depends on the particular student you're talking about. I think we see a little bit of all of that. There are certainly some students who I think they see their friends, for example, involved in volunteer opportunities. They're multi-sport athletes. They're doing cotillion on the weekend. And so there's a pressure among the peer group just to keep up or to feel like you're keeping up. So there's some of that. And then I think there are certain parents that see their friends giving their children those opportunities. And a lot of this is really well-meaning because parents want to give their children the best opportunities possible. But I think in doing that, it's very easy to fall into this idea that my child has to be exposed to everything in order to have a fair shot at being successful later.
Yeah, and it's interesting how you can say, a parent might say, well, I never told my child, but they're all interrelated. The parent expectations, the parents. So I always ask parents when I'm working with families, like, where did you go to college, and what did you study, and this kind of stuff, because even if that parent is dedicated to not putting pressure on their child, oftentimes their own experience kind of informs that child's expectations for the world. And even if the parent is explicitly not saying anything about high expectations, it's usually oftentimes there's making choices about where you live and where you go to school that are going to just be embedded with all kinds of messages and pressure.
Yeah, I coached my 7-year-old daughter's soccer team, assistant coach, I'd like to point out. But we have coaches training, and they said that they polled, this is AYSO soccer, and they polled soccer players from all across the country. They do it every year at the end of the season, and they said that when they ask what is the worst part of playing ASO soccer, that's one of their questions. They want to find out what's the negative experience. Top choice is the drive home from the game. And this idea that parents immediately need to give them the feedback, which often is negative. Mm-hmm. And I think about that with academics, right? Yeah. This idea that the emotional response to a report card or an email from a teacher, which may or may not have even been that negative, and what message that we send to kids when we don't let something sort of ruminate for a bit and think about it before we react to our kids who are going through so much stuff already, and they now have to process our angst. I don't know how you view that.
One of the challenges of being a parent is not personalizing your own children's behavior. And I think that's when you talk about that emotional response, a lot of times that's where it comes from, right? If my child makes a poor choice, sometimes it's hard as a parent not to feel embarrassed or worry that I'm being perceived as the parent that maybe didn't parent in the right way, or, so I think some of it comes from that for sure.
Yeah, it's interesting the questions we ask of our kids. And so that story about the soccer is really interesting, That, like, I never would have predicted that. That drive home after the game is such an unpleasant experience. It's like, let's analyze your performance today. And then, like, the questions, like, I think of my own parenting, because my kids are, 19 and 21 years old, so they're in college now. But, I don't feel like I was a nose to the grindstone. I'm going to really just grill you about your grades. But I would ask questions. I would say, oh, how would you do in that class? How would you do on that test? And I prided myself on not, like, hammering them if they didn't do as well as I wished. But I still was asking that question. I wasn't asking them about what their, favorite sports team was. I was asking about the school a lot of time.
Yeah. What does a healthy middle school life look like to you? If you had to paint the picture of a healthy middle school student life?
I would say someone who is working at their potential, whatever that means. I think for some students that could mean that they're getting all A's, and for some students that could be they're doing very average and just getting by. But if they're putting in good effort, and they can feel good about that, that's one piece of it. I would say getting to bed at a reasonable time. So 9, 10 o'clock, getting a good, 7 to 8 hours of sleep a night. Being involved in something, whether it's a sport or theater or something that they enjoy, but also having time to decompress. And I think that's the piece that's missing.
The decompression.
Yeah.
I think it's just such a tumultuous time for kids. To me, it is like the most difficult period to be a teacher, the middle school years. The kids, and I get to move around and see kids all the way from pre-kindergarten up through kids who are going to graduate from high school. And I just am always struck by the vulnerability of the middle school period and how it, oftentimes we recall it as being the most difficult period of our lives. Middle school was the hardest. That was worse for me, like that part of my schooling. So to me, the biggest thing would be to really focus on how the kids are relating to each other, because I think it's a time where kids can be particularly mean to each other. There's a lot of kind of social Darwinism going on. And to really focus on those character traits of how to be kind to one another, how to work together. If they can take that away and go into high school with some of that, that would be a huge success to me.
Yeah, I really agree with that last point. I think we have this sort of goal of high school preparation. Mm-hmm. But then so often, and this is probably schools across the country are guilty of this, you're not really preparing for high school so much as practicing high school. Mm-hmm. You kind of start doing it already in middle mm-hmm. school. Mm-hmm. And I think what you've described, that's what's missing. Mm-hmm. Those sort of non-academic skills and adaptations that are really going to make them successful no matter what they do. Yeah. What would advice do you give a middle school? How can you make middle school the most positive environment possible? What can teachers and administrators do?
It's a great question.
I think one of the things you could really do is just to focus on creating a positive culture and climate in your classroom. And that starts with the modeling of behavior by the teacher, like how am I relating to my students and what kind of, communication am I kind of encouraging in my class and what kind of communication am I allowing in my class. For example, one of the things I really tried to do when I taught was to be careful about relating to one another on a really sarcastic level. And the reason I did that is because I'm a thin-skinned person myself, so I didn't always do well with that kind of thing. But I also was trying to encourage kids to be authentic with their communication, because I would say in sarcasm, you never quite know where it's coming from and what's meant by it. It could be just harmless kidding, but oftentimes you're left with a really kind of yucky internal feeling, like maybe they were really serious when they said that.
Yes.
I also think authenticity is a biggie, because kids can see through adults that aren't authentic and that are just trying to win them over. So whoever you are when you're working with middle school kids, you just have to be you. And those are the teachers that tend to be the most popular and that kids relate with, because they know that you're not trying to win them over in some way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Kind of talking about your own vulnerability. I think it's very powerful for teachers to be able to show their own vulnerabilities, talk about their own failings to kids. Mm-hmm. That I always feel like that's such an effective strategy for dealing with kids, because I feel like when we set ourselves up as on a pedestal as exemplars of what is, it's distancing. Same, I think, talking about your kids. When you talk about how great your kids are, it's a distancing kind of thing to do. It kind of kicks in the competitive instincts of other parents. They start kind of thinking they're really doing a crummy job, and yet. So I like complaining about my kids sometimes, because I feel like when we talk about our failures as a parent, it brings us closer to other parents.
Okay. What are the signs of a vulnerable student? Because middle school students are so good at putting up shields, masks. Mm-hmm. They can get through a day. But as teachers who are working with those students, what are the signs that teachers should be looking for that might not be so obvious when that student walks through the door?
A major change in behavior is obvious, right? But I also think you can kind of tell the students that are a little bit more high-strung, perfectionistic. Oftentimes I find that those kids, even if they always have a smile on their face, are the ones that are suffering internally. And so, again, I really think it's about relationship building, because if you're building a strong relationship, if a student says something as simple as, oh, I'm really stressed out, and you take the time to have the conversation and get additional details, that can be really helpful, and maybe that's all they need.
Yeah, and I think the changes in behavior is a really big one. Is once you've known the student long enough to know if there's been some kind of change. But let's say you don't know the students. I think just like what's your experience of the student? Do they seem like they're participative and forthcoming? Do they seem authentic in their communication, or do they seem like relentlessly happy in a kind of a fake way? Do they seem incredibly shut down so that you don't know what's going on? If a student's hostile, sometimes they're the easiest ones because you know something's not going right if they're hostile. So they're kind of like crying out that there's an issue. I think sometimes quiet students are the most challenging ones because some people are just naturally reserved and shy, and that's just the way they are. But other times it's an expression of unhappiness and being really closed in.
Also, though, what is their relationship with their peers? As long as they have a peer group, that's really healthy because they're likely to open up to that group. And so the kids I'm most worried about are the kids that I see sitting alone at lunch, or, walking to class by themselves, or who are not participating in any extracurricular activities. And, they go home, come to school, but there's very little interaction. Or the kids in the classroom maybe who no one wants to pair up with.
How often do students come to you voluntarily versus they're referred by an adult?
Middle school students or students across the board?
Let's say middle school.
Okay, so we're in week 2? 3?
Yeah, 3-ish.
And I've had 3 kids come on their own so far. So it also depends on the group. Some of these students have been here since lower school, and so I've had a lot of interaction with them over the years, and they're more inclined to just pop into my office and say hello. It just depends on the group. I wouldn't say a huge amount. I definitely spend more of my time with lower school students as compared to middle school, but certainly there are middle school students who, once they make that initial connection, they're the ones that are more likely to come back.
Now, is that because middle school students are just less likely to want to ask for help? Is that?
I think they're more likely to turn to their peers, quite honestly.
Peers, okay.
And then if they get into a bind or they feel like maybe there's a sensitive topic that they don't want to go to peers with, then they might come into my office. And sometimes they're referred by teachers, or sometimes parents will reach out as well.
Right. Okay.
And they don't come to me at all because I'm not available. I'm kind of like, I don't have my own office. Right. But to me, it brings up an interesting question about availability. And that is that how, for example, as teachers, when I think back to when I was a teacher, really how available did I make myself? I didn't make myself available during lunch because I was eating with my peers. I wasn't particularly available before school because I was getting there and getting prepped. So after school, even if you are available, are you with other students? So where do students go? With Carmen, she has her own office and availability, but oftentimes, so to me, that's like a school culture kind of question too, is like, are we creating kind of spaces where we are available to kids? And that's sometimes hard to do.
Yeah, the lunch one is interesting because I think as teachers, we know that eating with students is a positive thing. But then lunch rolls around. Man, you know what I really need right now is a break from kids.
Exactly.
I can be in the vicinity of children, but I really don't think I could talk to children right now.
Right.
My peers are over here eating lunch. And I know, Carmen, you're wonderful about this, eating with kids, eating with the students. But that's a great point that I think for most of us we know, but do we go that extra step for that availability?
And it's also very valid, like when you say, I need to recharge during lunch, That's so like important because we need to have the juice to get through the day and be with our students when we're supposed to be with our students. So it is important.
And I will tell you, as much as I really do try a couple times a week to sit with students, there are times where I go and sit down and within a few minutes the students get up and leave because they also need that time to just chill out with their friends and not be in the presence of an adult. So I think it also works both ways.
Yeah,
that's
true.
Well, we ate lunch together today, and Carmen was constantly making eye contact with students and smiling. So she was doing lots of interaction and making herself very available.
Nice. But I agree, though. It's everybody. We get that. You have lunch with the students, and sometimes it's just awkward.
Yeah.
Because they just want to talk about whatever. They don't want to talk to you
Pokemon.
about it. Yeah, right. And the last thing they want is for you to try to weigh in on those topics.
Yep.
Like, really? Okay. Don't ask me what music I'm listening to.
Yeah. Don't try to be an authority in my world.
Yeah, that's right. Could either of you share a story, a positive story about a student or a parent that maybe was maybe a parent that was doing it right, that was that you see as a good example for helping students get through these years?
Can I give I mean, I don't necessarily want to name
Of course
someone, but okay. So I think an example of a good parent is someone willing to listen to their child when they say enough is enough, right? So if your child is coming home completely stressed out, I'm thinking of a specific parent a couple years ago whose daughter came to see me and was just really upset because she literally had an extracurricular activity every single day after school. And initially I spoke to the parent about it, and the parent said, yeah, but they tell me that they just love all their activities. And, but after a couple times of the child coming to me, I said, look, I'm wondering if you're open to looking at this, because what you're hearing at home is not the same as what I'm hearing at school. And so ultimately the parent was able to give the child permission to drop one of their activities, which was helpful. And I think too often, especially if we think our child is talented in a certain area, or, they have the potential to, I don't know, just excel in some way, we push too hard without listening to them.
But as parents, though, how do we navigate that? Because there are so many things for kids to do, so many opportunities. And I think about this a lot because I grew up in small town Maine, and my parents had like 2 things to choose from. It wasn't like a checklist of options. And so we had a lot of free time. And so just riding my bike around was always a thing that I did. Here, and just in 2019, there's just so many things. And especially if your child is really interested in a lot of things, how do you navigate that where you want to give them those opportunities, but at the same time not feel like you're overwhelming them?
What we kind of have a rule, because I have 3 children, so the youngest one isn't, thankfully, involved in anything just yet, but the older 2 have a limit of 2 activities. And even with that, there are weeks where it just feels absolutely overwhelming for us as parents, and our weekend is completely gone. We hand it over to sports, which is fine because it's fun to watch. But so that's our rule. And there are some parents that, think that their kids should do more than that. That just doesn't work for us. And I can tell because I can see my kids getting stressed out. Like once we get above that limit, they start having more meltdowns when they come home from school. They start complaining about having to go to the practices. And so for me, that's a sign like enough is enough.
Yeah, and I think it depends on your kids. Some kids have more energy and endurance. And they can probably do more. Also, you can think of categories like, okay, you can play one sport at a time. You can't be in 2 or 3 different ones at the same time. If you like music, you can play one instrument. You can play 2. I think you could kind of look at it that way, and then kind of look at what's the end look like of the day. How late are we going? That's important. Is there enough time to really be together as a family? If we want to eat together as a family, is there enough time to wind down and take a shower? Those kinds of things.
Yeah.
Please shower.
Yes. Students, if you're listening, please take a shower. Teachers too.
It's a public service announcement.
Family dinner is so important, right? This is one thing, like growing up, that was a non-negotiable for my parents. And I don't know, I don't really get a feel for our students or just students in general, if that still that's emphasized. I do hear about students, they eating dinner a lot in the car because they're going from one thing to the next. Dinner and other sort of family-related activities, what sense do you get that families are setting aside that kind of time?
I don't think they are. And a couple years ago at the school, I surveyed middle school students and asked them, what is something you wish your parents knew? And the overwhelming result was, I want my parents to get to know me as a person, and that the students were not perceiving their parents driving them from one activity to another as quality time. And so that was really something that they are wanting adults to hear. We want quality time. And I think from a parent perspective, parents often feel like, well, gosh, I'm sacrificing all my time to take my kids to these activities. And so, and my child doesn't appreciate this, but that's not what they're wanting. And I think sitting down at dinner time or spending 30 minutes before bedtime, just talking and allowing your child to lead the conversation is what kids are needing that they're not getting.
That's tricky. It's like, I don't even know what dinner is supposed to look like. I think I'm rushed through dinner. So a lot of times you'll be together as a family and you'll be like, okay, we've been here 15 minutes. We're done eating. Goodbye. I'll see you, and you do your things. It's like, I don't like, are we supposed to like define a time about how long we're supposed to sit down? Like, how do we know when we're done? We don't have dessert, so it's not the dessert. Are we supposed to talk about something meaningful? Mm-hmm. I guess I'm a little bit uncomfortable around the topic. I feel like as a family, my kids are grown now, but we would typically be together, but it was pretty short, and I don't know about the quality.
Okay. I think I agree with your point, Carmen, about the kids leading the conversation. We do this a lot at home, but because my kids are still young, the conversation is quite inane at times because their idea of leading conversation is sort of recapping in excruciating detail something that happened on the playground, or like an episode of Pokemon, and you give them the time and space to do that, but yeah, I don't know. To your point, Greg, too, I don't know that there's an easy way to sort of define what that looks like.
The other thing is that once they get to a certain age, they may not really want to talk, and then you can have a silent dinner. You can eat mindfully. Because, as kids get into the teen years, they oftentimes are pretty... I had 2 boys, okay, so that's my bias sample. But I think particularly boys, they may not, like they'll give you one-word replies to your questions. They may not really want to talk about their day, or they may not have topics of interest they want to talk about. So it always comes back to whenever we have these rules of thumbs, we have to adapt them and figure out how does it work for this particular kid.
Yeah.
Well, and with boys, I think they enjoy doing things. So again, it's about spend quality time doing something that your son enjoys.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Mm-hmm. Yeah. What's the importance of, just shifting gears here slightly, the parent-school relationship? What do schools do well that do it well, and what do parents do well that do it well to make sure that relationship is a positive one?
I think parents are involved when they need to be, but they don't overstep their bounds. So I think parents that kind of do it well, let teachers be teachers, are able to hear feedback about their child that may not be positive all the time, and then work with the teacher or an administrator to say, okay, what can I do in this situation to help make the situation better? And I think if they have a reaction that they disagree with related to a teacher or an administrator or the school, they don't badmouth the school in front of their child. Because I think some of what we see is that when children see their parents speaking poorly about anything, that changes their perspective.
Yeah, I think it's important for parents to be available, but not meddlesome. I think a parent should be very careful about intervening on their child's behalf. Mm-hmm. I think my rule as a parent was if there's a difference of 2 versions, one the teacher and one's you, I'm going to believe the teacher. I didn't really say that to them, but that's kind of my mindset, because I would typically feel that teachers, there's very little reason that they would be inventing things, but oftentimes kids will distort things, especially if they've done something they weren't supposed to do. So I want to be, as a parent, I would really want to be like available, and if there's an issue, to just be a good listener and not to try not to get defensive. If it's something about my child, just try to get the information. We oftentimes see just the opposite, where I think a parent may sometimes measure their effectiveness by the ferocity with which they advocate for their child, or so, and that sometimes I think is very disempowering. It's sending the wrong message. Like you say, sometimes it's really a negative, saying negative things about the school or about the teacher. Mm-hmm. So that can be really problematic.
And I think if you over-involve yourself, it really diminishes your child's agency, their sense of agency. Yeah, exactly. And I can speak to this a little bit, having worked in so many university counseling centers, because I would see kids walking across the courtyard who, were constantly on the phone with their parents because they literally didn't feel comfortable in their own body traveling from one building to another if they were not surrounded by a group of people.
Yeah, let's talk about that for a second, because those stories like that have been becoming a lot more frequent, of college students that can't be away from their parents. They can't basically manage their own schedule and time. But why is it that often these are children of successful people? So why often are successful people measuring their own success by their child's success? I've always been puzzled by this. You yourself are a successful person. You have defined your own success. So then why are you investing so much of your own personal ego or definition of success into how your child does?
I think successful people tend to be very driven and very type A. And so that probably like trickles down into their parenting style as well, right? And so unfortunately, I think it's hard for driven people sometimes, not always, to watch their child fail or make mistakes because they view their children as an extension of themselves, right? And so even though I'm sure they've had their own failures along the way, I would assume.
Well, and children are, in some ways, they're our legacy. They're our biological, our genetic legacy, and I think it's easy for them to see, like, and some parents say, parenting is the most important job in my life. Well, they're the outcome of your labor.
Yeah.
And I think we tend to be very judgmental of parents with regard to their children. So if your child is a great success, you are a marvelous parent. If they're in jail, you are a terrible parent.
Right. And maybe I'm only asking that question because my kids are still young. Maybe as they get older, I'll find myself like, oh, now I get it. I see why people do that. Okay. Yeah. One more question for you. Thanks so much for joining me today, by the way.
It's been fun.
It's fun, yeah.
If someone was designing a new school from the ground up and you were part of that team, what advice would you give? How would you design a new school with what you have learned through your work come to bear?
Well, going back to the start time, I would definitely have a later start time. I think there has to be an emphasis on the character of the students at the school. I think that hands-on learning is a lot more effective than students being lectured at. I think student-driven learning tends to make a bigger impression than, a teacher choosing what they're going to teach their kids. You have thoughts?
Well, just that. I think school is thought as, it's our experience in life of learning, but in fact, school is just preparing us for learning. So how can we prepare people? How can we go back to creating good, well-rounded people? Could we engineer a school so that from the get-go, kids understand that there's many pathways in life, that you could go into some vocation, that you could go to a community college and not have this kind of unwritten expectation from the first day of school that you're going to go to a 4-year university? I think of other countries like in Germany where they have this very well-developed apprenticeship program, and that people who go in and become auto mechanics or work in construction, I don't know, I've never lived there, but I've read that those people are respected. That is not considered to be an inferior profession.
Yeah, when I was in high school, the VOTEC kids, that was considered, those were the worst kids in school.
Right, like they couldn't cut it, so they had to do that.
Yeah, obviously he's not going to take honors, not even close, so probably he'll end up doing one of the mechanic classes. But I think, meanwhile, I just read about that we have a shortage of AC repair people in Southern California. It's like, well, maybe, maybe we should have done a better job of preparing people for that instead of...
They're left to fend for themselves. Like a construction worker, what's their training? It's on-the-job training. Most people, if they don't go in an academic path, they are out on their own when they graduate from high school, because a lot of high schools have essentially removed that track. And so they have to fend for themselves. It's just a crazy part of our system, I think. Barack Obama, actually, I agreed a lot with his policies, but one of the things he said is like, I envision a society where everyone will get a 4-year degree. And I thought, that's crazy. Not everyone needs to go to a four-year college. Not everybody wants to go to a four-year. Most of us have someone in our family who didn't go to a four-year college.
Mm-hmm. That's not how the world, that's not how the economy is set up for people running around with college degrees, especially with the price of college and debt and all that. That sounds like another podcast episode, though. Greg and Carmen, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank
Thank you.
A big thanks to Dr. Anderson and Dr. Koch for that conversation. If you're a teacher, I strongly recommend finding some time to talk to your school psychologist, just sitting down and picking their brain and hearing about the work they do and their thoughts on SEL or anything else in your mind. Really enlightening and a really great way to help me get insight, and I think help you get insight into how we can better help our students and better see our students. As always, welcome comments, questions on our Twitter feed @BigIdeaEd. New music today from the artist Molo. Que Extraño Es is the name of the song, courtesy of the Tribe of Noise. And thanks for listening, everyone. Check us out next time.
Hoy es el día que extraño es cuando te encuentro por segunda vez y no me conformo con mirar tu piel. Mañana te invito a un doble café.